There is clinical correlation with the theca cells. Now we said theca cells produce steroids. Now there is a clinical condition which is called PCOS. Okay, so what is PCOS? Polycystic ovary syndrome. So PCOS is because there is overactivity of the thecal cells, so it produces lots of steroids. Okay, but all of those steroids is not converted by the granulosa cells to estrogens. Okay, so that's the problem here. So the sign is that there is hyperandrogenism. Okay, so now we know why there is hyperandrogenism. Okay, it's because the thecal cells produce lots of steroids. Okay, so how is this treated? So polycystic ovarian syndrome, there is hyperglycemia, okay, meaning insulin sensitivity of the ovaries is decreased. So usually drugs like metformin is administered in this disease. Okay, but then the management of polycystic ovary syndrome hopefully we'll take up in another lecture. But this is just for your understanding that there is a clinical pathology associated with thecal cells. Okay, so let's draw a typical ovary and see what's going on. Okay, so this is just a diagrammatic representation. So I'm trying to represent a typical ovary, and the ovary would have blood vessels coming in. And let's draw what is typically found in follicles. So we'll have in the ovary. Okay, so this is a diagrammatic representation of the ovary. And what we would see is lots of cells like this. So let's say these things have got the okay, and then there are cells slightly bigger than this. Okay, so let's write what these are and then we'll continue. Okay, so these are primordial follicles. Okay, so we said primordial follicles contain what? The primary oocytes. And these are about 19 micrometer in diameter. And so these are basically resting follicles, okay? So something bigger than that is a follicle that goes into development. Okay, so let's call this the primary follicle. And slightly bigger would be a secondary follicle. And as we said, it's got the thecal layer. And then from then on, we see vacuoles coming around with the cells. So if those are the cells, if these are all cells, and there is a vacuole, that vacuole we said is called antrum, filled with estrogens. Okay. Then that becomes bigger, and it becomes still bigger. Okay, so that's a mature follicle that we call a, what's it called? It's called a Graafian follicle. Okay, and then what happens? The Graafian follicle ruptures, and it releases the ova, okay, along with some cells. Okay, so that's the released ova, not ova, the secondary oocyte. Okay, and then what happens to this follicle is that again it gets invaginated, or the membrane comes together, and it forms what was that called? It was called the corpus luteum. Okay, and if pregnancy doesn't happen, we said that the corpus luteum just kind of degenerates. Okay? So this is a young corpus luteum. And this is a mature corpus luteum. And this is regressing corpus luteum, and ultimately it becomes a scar tissue. Okay, so that is called corpus albicans. Okay, so we have primordial follicles, we have this is a vesicular follicle. That's also called an antral follicle. Okay. Antral follicle. And this, we said, is a Graafian follicle. So that will be and this will all be cells, and that would be the vacuole. Okay, so these are all cells. Okay, and this is the miniature version of that. Again, surrounded by a vacuole. And when it attains full maturity, we call it a Graafian follicle. Now let's look at the timeline. Okay, so this is at day 1 of the follicular phase. Okay, we'll be learning what the follicular phase is in just some time. So just hold on to that thought. So by about day 4, you'll have about this type of follicles, okay, day 4. And by day 8, it would have matured into a secondary follicle, and so on. So a mature follicle or a Graafian follicle would be about, say, the 13th day. Okay, day 30. And this would be day 12. Okay, and let's say 14th day we have ovulation, or the secondary oocyte coming out. Okay, so that is day 14. So then what happens? We have the young corpus luteum formed at, say, day 18, and the mature corpus luteum at day 22, and by day 28, okay, so there would have been total atrophy, okay, and there would be formation of corpus albicans. Okay, so these days are important. From this we understand these are the phases in the ovary. Okay, so ovary, you've got different phases. Okay, so we'll be discussing that in detail some bit later. But the point is, somewhere here, for the maturation to happen, we need what? We need the follicle stimulating hormone. Okay. So follicle stimulating hormone just reaches the selected secondary follicle to mature and become a Graafian follicle and eventually release the oocyte. Okay. So that is the role of FSH. We'll come back to this later, but what's important to know is that at day 14, ovulation happens. Okay. So day 14. Okay. So we'll be considering these things. We'll come back to this figure again. So this is just a prelude to what we are going to discuss. Right? Okay, there is one more point that we need to remember here, is that the thecal cells are here. These thecal cells have access to blood vessels, okay? They have access to blood vessels, meaning they are vascular. If you think about the other cells, they don't have blood vessels coming in. Okay, so after ovulation, after the ova goes off, what would happen is, do you see this? These blood vessels are near these cells. These cells obviously would break open, and that would, damage these blood vessels. As a result, after the secondary oocyte is released out during ovulation, the corpus luteum will fill with blood. Okay, so that is sometimes called corpus hemorrhagicum. Okay, so meaning there is hemorrhage there. Okay, so that's an important point for us to remember. Okay, so let's look at this figure again just before we go. That there are 2-3 things happening. One is the follicles are becoming bigger. Okay. Okay. So if you think about it, from primordial follicles, we have the Graafian follicles. So follicles are developing, and the secondary oocyte is going out, and then corpus luteum is formed. This happens in sequence. Okay. So we can say what are the phases. So this sequence of events are called the phases of the ovarian cycle. Okay, so you got the follicular phase, the ovulation phase, and the phase of the corpus luteum. So that is called luteal phase. Okay, so there are 3 phases. What are they? Follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. Okay, so those are the 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. So we'll come back to this again. Okay, so let's continue with our discussion and begin our discussion on the female reproductive cycle. Okay. So let's begin in the beginning. What are we drawing here? You're right, we're talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Okay, so we have got the hypothalamus here, and we have the anterior pituitary. Okay, and anterior pituitary secretes the gonadotropin. Gonadotropins, FSH and LH. So let's draw it here. It releases FSH and LH. Okay, the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. Now, the secretion of the hypothalamus, what is it called? Gonadotropin releasing hormone, okay, GnRH. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, the gonadotropin releasing hormone begins its secretion, and the fashion of the secretion is it is pulsatile. Okay. Okay, meaning it's not at a time. It varies throughout the day. So that's when something like that happens, we call it pulsatile. So the secretion is pulsatile, and it begins at puberty. Okay. So the question is, why does it begin at puberty? So recent evidence has shown that there is a protein called KIS1. Okay. So this proteins, so this is a gene, a KIS1 gene. Okay, and it produces a protein called kispeptin. Okay, so this kispeptin is the stimulus for the hypothalamus to start producing GnRH. And so this kispeptin is expressed at puberty. So what exactly triggers the expression of the KIS1 gene, it is still being unraveled. Hopefully in some time we would have the full picture. Okay, so so this gene and its product triggers the hypothalamus to release GnRH during puberty. Okay, so puberty. Okay, so why does GnRH start stimulating, releasing GnRH at puberty? So this might be the explanation. Okay, so the exact mechanism will be known as it is unraveled. Okay, so the female reproductive cycle begins due to this at puberty. Okay, so up till now we are considering that we are talking about development. We talked about how a sperm and an egg fuses to form a zygote, and that zygote ultimately gives rise to the gametocytes. Okay, so I'm sorry, the zygote gives rise to the organism. Okay, and we have talked about what happens in during embryogenesis, how a follicle is formed. We have talked about all those aspects of development. Okay, so now we are taking this story further. Okay, we are now seeing a primordial follicle in an ovary, and now we are taking this story of what happens next. Okay, all right. So, so the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone in pulsatile sequences releases gonadotropin, which brings these bring cyclic changes in the ovary. Okay, this brings cyclic changes in the ovary and the uterus. Okay. And this change, this cyclic change, is called the reproductive cycle. Okay, it's called the reproductive cycle. So what's a reproductive cycle? The cyclic changes in the where the ovary and the uterus is called the reproductive cycle. For the sake of study, we divide the reproductive cycle into two parts. We divide the reproductive cycle into two parts. One we call the ovarian cycle, and the other we call the uterine cycle. Okay? Together they are also called the menstrual cycle. Okay? Right. So the idea is the hypothalamus releases GnRH that acts on the anterior pituitary, which releases the gonadotropins. These gonadotropins initially bring changes in the ovary, and then the ovary releases certain hormones, and those hormones along with the gonadotropins bring about changes in the uterus. Okay, so the ovarian cycle basically controls the uterine cycle. Okay, so the prime importance is the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle controls the uterine cycle. Okay, so let's write it down there and then discuss why. Okay, ovarian cycle controls the uterine cycle. Okay, so let us discuss why this might be so. Now, what happens? What is the end point of the ovarian cycle? It is the release of the secondary oocyte. Now, this secondary oocyte comes out of the ovary, is picked up by the fimbriae of the fallopian tubes, and it moves up into the ampulla. And then what happens? This sperm reaches the ampulla. There is fertilization, and the fertilized ova, which is now called the zygote, moves down the fallopian tube and it enters the uterus and gets implanted in the walls of the uterus. Okay, so there should be a synchronized effort between these two organs. The ova should be released, and that ova should reach the uterus, and by the time it reaches the uterus should be prepared for implantation. So that is the reason why the ovarian cycle controls the uterine cycle. Okay? All right, so let's look at the ovarian cycle. Okay? So what is the ovarian cycle? This cyclic changes brought about in the ovary by gonadotropins. Okay, so this is called the ovarian cycle. And we have seen that the ovarian cycle can be divided into three phases. Okay? There are three phases. So what are the three phases? Yes. follicular phase, the follicular phase, ovulation, and you're right, the luteal phase. Okay, so there are three phases of the ovarian cycle. And what are the three phases? It is the follicular phase, the ovulation, and the luteal phase. Okay? So the gonadotropins, let's write here, it is controlled by the gonadotropins. Gonadotropins control the ovarian cycle. Okay? So what is happening here? Okay, let's go back to the picture. Okay, so we have the follicle stimulating hormone and LH. They will stimulate the development of the follicles. Okay, so at a time more than one primordial follicle mature. Okay, and out of that only one becomes the dominant follicle. Okay, and that dominant follicle, what does it do? It continues to grow. It becomes a Graafian follicle and so on. Okay, so what happens to the others which are not selected? They degrade. Okay, so only one will mature at a time under normal physiological conditions. Okay, and for that, this stimulus is the follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, the thing that you need to remember here is that as the follicle is maturing, the thecal cells begin to secrete estrogen. Okay, so there is a gradual increase in estrogen. Okay, and that has got a role here. Okay, okay, so we will talk about that. Okay, we also need to remember that the length of the reproductive cycle is 28 days. Okay, so this is an ideal condition. All right. The range is usually 21 to 35 days before it is considered pathological, meaning if you got a reproductive cycle less than 21 days, then one needs to look whether it has got any underlying causes. It is not considered normal. And if it is beyond 35 days, then too, we'll be looking at whether it is pathological or not. Okay, so this is the range of a normal cycle. Okay, but on an average, it is considered to be 28 days. So in our further discussion, we'll be looking at this average, and based on the average duration, we are going to base our discussion on. Okay. Okay. So let's pick up this story that way. So let's consider this is the first day of the reproductive cycle, and let's draw it up to 28 days. Okay. So this axis is the days. Somewhere middle, 14th day is considered the mid-cycle. Okay. So now let's see what's happening. So we have got initially, say, 10 to 12 follicles. Ten to 12 follicles begin to grow and develop. Out of this, one is selected, okay, and that one becomes a Graafian follicle, and it releases the secondary oocyte on the 14th day, okay, which we call ovulation. That happens mid-cycle. Okay, so let's look at how FSH is varying. FSH and LH. So we said for the development of the follicles, we need FSH. Okay. And how does FSH come into being? Because it is released by the, so if that is the hypothalamus, and if this represents the pituitary, then, and this represents the anterior pituitary. So what happens? Hypothalamus releases the GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, okay? And that acts on the anterior pituitary. What is released? FSH and LH. So this FSH and LH act on the follicles, and these two hormones are responsible for the development of the follicles. Okay, so predominantly FSH is working, but LH is aiding the FSH in bringing about development of the follicle. Okay, so now at this time what's happening? As the follicle is continuing to grow, the theca cells are continuing to release estrogen. Okay, so estrogen is going to increases in concentration. Okay, so this estrogen, what does it do? This estrogen has a negative feedback. Okay, it has got a negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Okay, it's got a negative feedback. So initially, the concentration of estrogen, where is the estrogen produced? It is produced by the thecal cells in conjunction with the granulosa cells. We said theca cells produces the steroids, which is converted by the granulosa cells into estrogen. Okay, so what's happening? This estrogen that is produced, okay, that continues to increase as the follicle increases in size. Why? Because as the follicle increases, there are more number of thecal cells, there are more number of granulosa cells, so they can produce more estrogen. So as the follicles grow, the amount of estrogen continues to grow. So initially it is very low. So low levels of estrogen decrease the release of GnRH. As a result, FSH and LH will not rise. Okay, it won't increase. It will kind of taper down. Okay, so so initially there is a bit of a rise, then okay, so let's trace what's happening. Okay, so let that be LH. Okay, and let's draw something like this as the FSH. Okay, so this is mid-cycle. Okay, so this is growing and yeah. So this is okay growing like that. The concentration in the blood. Then what happens? This is the initial stage when estrogen is low. After that, what happens? The follicles become bigger in size. So by nearing the 14th day, midday of the cycle, the follicles kind of increase in size. And here there is release of the ovum. Okay, this ovulation. Okay. So up to this stage, the follicles are kind of very, very small. Okay, so smaller than this, really small. Okay, so on a relative scale, let's draw this better. Let's show this as kind of like that. And then it's a little bit bigger. And a little bit more bigger. Okay, so as the follicle is increasing in size, thecal cells and granulosa cells are increasing. As a result, estrogen is going to rise. So let us look at the level of estrogen. Okay. So estrogen, initially it was kind of low, okay? And then, as the size increases, it is releasing more and more of estrogen. So there will be an increase in estrogen. Okay, so after ovulation happens, what happens? These granulosa cells do not produce any significant amount of estrogen till it becomes a corpus luteum. Okay, so this kind of continues to decrease and it continues to decrease, and then after ovulation, corpus luteum is being formed. As a result, after the mid-cycle, it begins to rise again. Okay. And it rises again like that. Okay, and then, so that is the rise of estrogen. So let's label here. This is estrogen, okay, specifically estradiol. Okay. So that is the level of estrogen. Now this estrogen has got certain functions. This estrogen will act on the granulosa cells, okay? The LH will act on the granulosa cells and increase the conversion of the steroids to estrogen. Okay, so that is why again there is an increase in estrogen. Okay, so estrogen increases due to the increased production of estrogen by the granulosa cells because the number is increasing. Secondly, because this LH stimulates the conversion of steroids to estradiol. Okay, and the reaction that LH stimulates is called aromatization. Okay, so not only is it due to the increase in size, it's also because of the stimulation of the granulosa cells by the LH, which results in increased estradiol levels here. Okay. So this increased estradiol, okay, so up till now it was low level. Okay, low level of estrogen, what does it do? It has got an inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus. Okay, but now there is an increase in estradiol. Okay, so estrogen. So this increase, what does it do? It has got a stimulatory effect on the hypothalamus. Okay, because of the stimulatory effect, what happens? Increased amount of gonadotropin releasing hormone is secreted. It's a pulsatile release. Okay, so it is released every 2 hours. Okay. Okay, so it increases the GnRH, and that in turn increases FSH and LH. But the estrogen, it makes the hypothalamus secrete GnRH, and that GnRH is more selective towards LH. Okay, so as a result, what happens is the LH level really shoots up. Okay, by in fact before the ovulation. Okay, just a little bit before the ovulation. So if this is the ovulation, just ahead of ovulation, the peak level of estradiol, LH is seen. And this again tapers down. Okay. So this FSH also increases, but it doesn't increase as much as LH. Okay, so that goes like that. Okay. Okay. So this increased LH, this is LH. The increased level of LH, okay, so let's write it here. Increased level of LH triggers ovulation. Okay, so now ovulation takes place. Okay. Then what happens? As you see, this estrogen level is showing a secondary rise. So what happens is, this follicle which has released the secondary oocyte becomes corpus luteum. Okay, so this corpus luteum secretes estrogen and progesterone. Okay. So this estrogen that is released by the corpus luteum is responsible for the secondary rise. Okay, so that is what we are saying here. Okay. So ovulation usually happens 1 day after the LH surge. So let's write it down here. Ovulation occurs 1 day after LH surge. Okay, surge means rapid increase in concentration. All right. Okay. So what is happening at this time? If we look at the ovary, we have got this follicle, okay, this big follicle, it's going to break down. This big follicle is called Graafian follicle. It breaks down, releasing the secondary oocyte. So you see there is damage to the cells. As a result, lots of prostaglandins will be released, and those prostaglandins and other mediators can make the woman feel an abdominal pain in the ovary which has ovulated. Okay, so in this side where ovulation has taken place, the woman might feel abdominal pain. Okay, so abdominal pain on this side where ovulation has taken place. Okay, so abdominal pain would be experienced by the woman who is got ovulation at this side of the body where the ovulation has occurred. Okay. Okay. The progesterone and the estrogen secreted by the corpus luteum, this again causes negative inhibition of the hypothalamus. Okay, meaning very less amount of FSH and LH will be released after ovulation. You see this? The concentration of LH and FSH is really becoming low. Why? Because this progesterone and estrogen produced by the or secreted by the corpus luteum is exhibiting feedback inhibition of hypothalamus. Okay, so that is why no egg will mature at this low level of LH and FSH, because you see here it is kind of higher than the concentration here. Okay, so my drawing might not be very apparent, but these levels are lower than these levels here. Okay, so that cannot stimulate a fresh follicle to become a Graafian follicle. Okay, so the thing is, if at this time pregnancy occurs, then there won't be further development of the egg, because FSH and LH will be significantly low in concentration. It will prevent another egg from maturing when a pregnancy is underway. Okay, so that is again a protective mechanism of the body. It's a feedback mechanism. Okay. All right. So these are the hormonal effects that are seen in the ovarian cycle. Okay. Okay. At this time, what is happening in the uterus? Okay, so let's draw a picture of the uterus so that we are orientated as to where we are. Okay. So this is a very general diagrammatic representation. Diagrammatic representation of the fallopian tube. This is a very diagrammatic representation. of what uterus typically would look like. Okay, so this is, I've cut a section. Okay, cut a section. Okay, and so this represents the uterus. Okay, and somewhere here we have this is the ovary. Okay, so ovary would be near the fimbriae. So let's bring it near the fimbriae. I guess somewhere here we have the ovary. And this is the fallopian tube. Okay, so this part is called the infundibulum. This is the ampulla. In fact, this whole region is the ampulla. Okay, so that's the ampulla. Okay, so this entire region is the ampulla. Here, where the fallopian tube kind of narrows down, this is called the isthmus. Okay, after isthmus, we would find a narrow portion inside the uterus, which is called the intramural. Okay, so let's write it, intramural, okay, region. Okay, and yeah. So what's happening? The egg is released from where? From the ovary. Egg is released from the ovary, and it is picked up. It reaches the infundibulum. Okay, so it reaches the ampulla. It's in the ampulla fertilization occurs. Okay, so fertilization occurs in the ampulla, and the zygote moves down the tube, and then it gets implanted in the walls of the uterus for when pregnancy occurs. Okay, so this is how pregnancy occurs in the uterus. So up till now we have talked about the cyclical changes in the ovary. Okay, so these cyclical changes, how does it affect the uterus is what we are going to look at now. Okay, so the changes brought about in the uterus under the influence gonadotropins and hormones released in the ovary is called the uterine cycle. Okay, it's also called the menstrual cycle. Okay, so the changes that is brought about in the uterus, the cyclical changes, okay, brought about in the uterus under the influence of the gonadotropins and hormones released in the ovary is called the uterine cycle. So think about this. This ovary is releasing the hormones into the blood. Okay, and that blood is reaching the uterus. Okay, and through the blood, whatever hormone is produced here is reaching the uterus. So that's why it's called an endocrine system, endocrine transport of the hormones. And those hormones act on the uterus and bring about changes. That's what we're going to study now. So the uterine cycle, so let's say the uterine cycle can be divided again into 3 phases. One is called the proliferative phase. Okay. The second the secretory phase, the proliferative phase, the secretory phase, and the menstrual flow phase. Okay, menstrual flow phase. Before we further discuss, let's look at the layers of the uterus. Okay, layers. So the layers we can, for some reason this is getting stuck. Okay, so the layers from outer to inner. Okay, outer to inner. Okay, that is what we are looking at. Okay, outermost layer to innermost layer. It is perimetrium, okay, myometrium, and endometrium. Okay, perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. Okay, so this endometrium, again there are 3 layers. What are the 3 layers? The 3 layers are the compact layer, okay, there are the spongy layer and the basal layer. So the compact layer and the spongy layer together is called the functional layer. Functional layer of the endometrium. Okay. So this functional layer is sloughed off in menstruation. Okay, which is the flow of blood and debris from the vaginal opening. Okay, and it is from the uterus, as we are about to discuss. Okay. All right. So it begins with the estradiol. Let's write here. Estradiol, okay, and progesterone. Okay, and estradiol. Okay, so initially we said there is a release of estradiol due to the growth of the follicles. Now this estradiol tells the uterus, or it makes the uterus to thicken. Okay. It makes the uterus thicken. Okay. So after ovulation, what happens? The corpus luteum now secretes estradiol and progesterone. Okay? So they stimulate the maintenance and further development. Okay, maintenance and further development of the uterus. Okay, maintenance and further development of the uterus. Now, if the embryo, okay, if there is no embryo, okay, meaning there is no fertilization, then what happens is, or if there is no embryo, or if the embryo has not been implanted, that's the technical word, so let's write it down. There is no implantation. Okay, then what will happen is corpus luteum will degenerate, meaning it won't produce estrogen or progesterone. Okay. As a result, what will happen? The uterine lining, the functional layer of the uterus will disintegrate. Okay. As a result, functional layer will disintegrate. Okay. The functional layer, which is the functional layer? It is the compact layer, and this spongy layer will disintegrate. Okay. And then at this time, the tissue which had proliferated has got blood vessels in it. It has got blood vessels. Okay, so this blood vessels will also disintegrate. As a result, what will happen? Blood will also be there. Okay. So this will be shed through the vaginal opening, and this is called menstrual flow. Okay? So this phase will last a few days, the menstrual flow phase, and after that new follicles will begin to develop. Okay, so this is basically what happens, how the ovarian cycle controls the uterine cycle. Okay. So what are the steps of the uterine cycle? They are 1, the proliferative phase, 2, secretory phase, then 3, the menstrual flow phase. Okay. So yeah. As for the ovarian cycle, let's look at the timeline of what's happening. Okay. Let's write it like that. The first day to the 4th day. Okay. So this, let's divide it like this. First day to the 4th day. 4th day to the 15th day. And 15th day to day 25, and day 25 to day 28. Okay, so this is the length of the reproductive cycle. Both ovarian and uterine cycle, it is an average of 28 days. So the first 4 days, okay, this is the beginning of bleeding. So the menstrual cycle is, the day is counted from the beginning of the bleeding. The day on which the bleeding happens, that is the beginning of the cycle. Okay, so there is beginning of bleeding, and that bleeding is due to what? It is due to necrosis. Okay, so the body has 2 ways in which it kills off its tissue. One is apoptosis and one is necrosis. Okay, so body normally gets rid of cells by 2 processes. One is apoptosis and one is necrosis. Okay, so necrosis is usually associated with inflammation, and that results in pain. Okay, so there is pain associated with the menstrual cycle. Okay, because there is tissue damage. Lots of mediators of pain, as we said, prostaglandins and other mediators are released, and that results in pain. Okay, so yeah, anyway, it is due to necrosis and shedding of the functional layer. Of the uterus. Okay. So, what has happened? Functional layer has gone. Okay. So, what is left is the basal layer. So, now the functional layer has to grow. Okay. So, that is why days 4 to 15, this is called the regeneration phase. Regeneration of the functional layer. Okay, so that happens on between day 4 and day 15. Okay, so this is the proliferation phase. Okay, regeneration of the functional layer, meaning the functional layer is growing. So whatever grows, we call it proliferation. Okay, so this is the proliferation. Proliferation stage of the uterine cycle. So from 15th to 25th day, what happens is the functional layer is fully developed. So the uterus attains its final thickness, and it begins, and the glands in the uterus begin to secrete. Okay, so that is why it is called the secretory phase. Okay, why is it called secretory phase? Because glands in the uterus begins to secrete. Okay, so this secretion enables the zygote to implant. Okay, so this is the stage where implantation occurs. So which stage in the uterine cycle does the zygote implant? Then it is the secretory phase. Okay? 25 to 28, this is called the premenstrual phase. Okay, so in premenstrual phase, there is ischemia. Ischemia because of reduced blood flow to the endometrium. Okay, why is there reduced blood flow to the endometrium? Because all the blood vessels that were there, they have been removed in menstruation. Okay, so the functional layer is lost. The functional layer had lots of blood vessels. Those blood vessels are also lost. As a result, the endometrium does not receive enough blood, and this period causes ischemia. Okay, so physiologically, if we see, there is certain signs associated with the uterine cycle. Okay, so let me label it down here. This is the uterine cycle. Okay, we are talking about the timeline. Okay, so when there is regeneration of the functional layer, the body temperature becomes lower. Okay, so on average, what is observed is the body temperature drops. Okay, it now becomes 97.5. So that is the time what happens, there is proliferation going on. In the secretory phase, the body temperature rises. Okay, so it reaches 98 Fahrenheit. Okay. So this was previously utilized for birth control. Okay, knowledge about this decrease in temperature. Okay, during the functional regenerative phase, the proliferation phase, it gives the woman an idea as to when she is ovulating. Okay, so that was one of the bases for this symptothermal method of contraceptive practice. Okay, so this is what happens in the uterine cycle. The fact to remember here is it is the progesterone. So let me write it down somewhere here. Progesterone, okay, stimulates what? The endometrium to enter into the secretory phase. To enter into the secretory phase. Okay, so progesterone makes the uterus go into the secretory phase. And where is that progesterone coming from? It is coming from the corpus luteum. Okay? All right. The other fact to remember is that after implantation occurs, the placenta forms. Okay? So this placenta is the source of human chorionic gonadotropin, okay, which is another gonadotropin that we are going to study. So it is generated from the placenta. Okay, and the placenta also maintains the uterus. Okay, it does not allow the degeneration of the functional layer. Okay, so that is the role of placenta. The placenta also produces the steroid hormones. estrogen and progesterone, okay, which maintains the uterus. Okay, it does not allow, once implantation occurs, the menstruation doesn't happen. Okay, because estrogen and progesterone, as we have studied, will maintain the uterus.